Hey, so thanks for the intro. I really appreciate the time to be able to talk about something that is maybe a little bit more ambitious than the average CMMC webinar that a lot of people have become used to over the last year or two. So, in general, after having worked with so many companies, so many small and medium-sized companies in the defense industrial base over the last several years, even well before CMMC was becoming a thing, it was very apparent that the same questions were being raised over and over and over and over again. And I always tell people that you could only be asked these same sorts of questions about how to do things or how CMMC and DFARS came around to be before you start asking the question of why everyone is asking the same question all the time. And it implies that there's more of a systemic issue at play because of the consistency of the knowledge gaps that you see as you survey all these companies over and over again. And so that kicked off a project that's really lasted the last, probably 2 years or so off and on, just as a personal passion project. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, is we're going to talk about how this story has evolved over the years. And that provides some distinct advantages over sort of your normal implementation webinar related to CMMC, because for anybody that's confused about where everything came from or where everything is going, especially with the upcoming final rule, then this is really what this content is designed to help clarify. And so by the end, we'll get some perspective and some really distinct clarity on why things are the way they are. And that has the advantageous effect of letting us be able to reliably predict what will be contained in the upcoming final rule that we're all so excited to see. So how are we going to do that? We're going to try to explain the arc of CMMC, CUI, and DFARS through as much of a story as we possibly can. So at first, we're going to cover the timeline, which goes back quite a bit further than most people realize. We're going to cover the first flurry of DoD rulemaking, from 2010 to 2013, which a lot of people are unaware even happened. Then we'll catch up to the current set of rules that were made 2015 to 2018 that we currently are operating under. We'll talk about where things went wrong after that rulemaking was finished. And then finally, we'll talk about this interesting wrinkle that exists in the nature of CMMC and 800-171 and how the interplay between those two leads to some surprising conclusions. And at the end, we'll try to summarize the sweeping survey that we do of the landscape here and provide some key takeaways. Okay, so the timeline, like I said, goes back quite a bit further than most people realize, and it actually can be traced all the way back to the post 9/11 Commission report. So a lot of people are familiar with the fact that the government was identified as having an information sharing problem, and this extended to things beyond just classified information. This included unclassified information as well. And so after the 9/11 Commission report came out, there was a series of pieces of legislation that tried to kick off what they called the information sharing environment. Because not only did the federal government need to get better about sharing classified information, but they needed to get better about sharing unclassified information that was primarily related to terrorism. And they discovered that, there is unclassified information that is still sensitive and needs to be protected, despite the fact that it is not actually classified. And so over the years, there were a series of presidential memorandums that tried to kickstart the executive branch agencies into marking and sharing and protecting and safeguarding and all of the sort of fundamental tenets that we hear about with the CUI program today. Tried to kick that off in earnest in the early 2000s. This is where the term CUI came from. The government started to slowly crystallize its ability to understand and explain the concept of unclassified data that still needs to be protected. So then in 2009, almost 10 years after this information sharing environment, tried to get started, the Obama administration finally said, okay, executive branch agencies, get together and let us know what do we need to do for this CUI program that we've tried to stand up. We have a CUI framework and we have some legislative mandates and we have all of these ingredients, but nothing's actually happening yet, and it seems to be getting worse. So the executive branch agencies got together and they wrote this task force report that had 40 recommendations in it. And the number 2 recommendation, besides besides considering, excuse me, besides considering the fact that the CUI program was extremely important, was to dramatically expand the definition of CUI to include all kinds of sensitive information that's unclassified beyond just terrorism information. And so as a result, most of the recommendations that are in that report were essentially bottom lined by the executive order that we all have come to know and love, because that really represents the big bang moment for the CUI program as we understand it today. So this executive order essentially needs three things to be implemented in a specific order. The first thing that it needs to do is it needs to implement a federal CUI rule or an implementing directive for the entirety of the executive branch agencies in terms of how they're going to handle this data. The second thing that it needs to do is it needs to develop a set of security requirements that can exist in non-federal systems. The federal government was relatively familiar at this point with protecting sensitive, unclassified information within systems that they own and operate. But what happens when that information exists in a non-federal organization? Still have to protect it, but we can't exactly port over the exact same requirements. So we need to engineer a solution. And then in order to inject that normalized set of security protections into the contracting base, we're going to have to create a FAR rule, or a Federal Acquisition Regulation rule. Typically, in the conversation around CMMC and DFARS, we consider the FAR and the DFARS alone, but the scale of the executive order applies to the entirety of the contracting base and its interface into the executive branch agencies and the flow of information between those various elements. And so that's a simple enough set of requirements that we need to have implemented in order to implement the executive order. The problem is that it takes quite a long time for the implementing directive to actually come together. Between November of 2010 and September of 2016, the government had to deal with the fact that it had accumulated a tremendous amount of organizational debt. And if you go back and you listen to how the National Archives and Records Administration, who was the administration put in charge of the program, when they explain the course of trying to develop what eventually becomes the CUI registry and eventually becomes the CUI marking program, they say, we had to go to every single element in the executive branch and ask them, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And why are you doing it? And then try to make sense of what's going on. So it's really the ultimate sort of deduplication effort, where NARA has to go around and synthesize over 2,200 different laws and regulations and government-wide policies into what we now know as the CUI registry, which is really like 20-something categories of information that needs to be protected. And they needed to take 150 different marking schemes and synthesize those down into a single marking scheme that the entire government was going to use. So when you look at the scale of the job that they needed to do, it's actually pretty impressive that it only took 6 years to do that. And it's important to remember this whenever we look at the CUI registry today, and you hear people say, "Oh, well, there's more than 20 categories in here. That's a whole lot of things that we need to keep track of," because it's actually a fraction of the number of categories that existed prior to the implementation of the CUI program. So, that makes sense that there's organizational debt, and that would be simple enough. The problem is that this wasn't the only timeline that was occurring. There were actually other timelines happening in parallel. So in late December 2002, FISMA is passed, and this sort of sets the tone for the information security programs across the federal government. It rescinded a bunch of waivers from legislation in the 80s that allowed federal agencies to basically categorize and treat information however they saw fit. And it said, we're going to normalize a risk-based approach to how the government is going to protect data, how it's going to design systems, how we're going to manage and govern information security across the government. And so as a result, there were several NIST publications that came about in the wake of FISMA that form essentially how the government is going to run risk management across its information enterprise. So FIPS 199 basically formalizes the idea of the confidentiality, integrity, and information and availability triad across the federal government. And it's going to categorize information by impact level. So we have low, moderate, and high impacts across the three fundamental tenets of information security for all of the government information and information systems that they need to run, design, and manage. in order to uphold the basic requirements that are outlined in FIPS 200, sort of the overall idea of what you need to do, there is a catalog contained in NIST SP 853 that is, it's thousands of individual controls and subcontrols. It's the how you might actually achieve the performance requirements, the descriptions that are contained in FIPS 200 that result from the categorization process in FIPS 189. So these three things together sync up so that the federal government is able to govern their information security in a coherent way. In parallel to those two timelines, you also have this sort of DoD timeline where some early intrusion activity in the early 2000s kicks off this process of needing to identify critical infrastructure sectors, needing to assign coordinating councils for those critical infrastructure sectors. And the federal government starts to get very serious about making sure that they are both applying information protections to critical infrastructure as well as extending security requirements to the contractors in those critical infrastructure sectors. So in mid 2007, the DoD gets tapped to stand up what we now know as the DIB-CS program. And they say, well, we need to start sending these requirements into the contracting base for how to protect information, for how to protect these systems. We need to try to bring up the overall level of security around the government and the contracting base. And in order to do that, we have to go through the rulemaking process. So in early 2010, they actually released this sort of first advance notice that we're going to start making rules that are going to inject guidance into the contracting base about what to do, what to protect, how to protect it, so on and so forth. And so when these three timelines sort of run right into the open door of the door opened by organizational debt in the CUI program, that is when we really start to cement the problem that has carried forward into the confusion that we're all facing today. And these timelines eventually converge in 2013, and that convergence is where some assumptions and some decisions are made that are maybe otherwise reasonable, but have sort of set the baseline for some of the issues that everyone's running into. Okay, so when we get into the timeline convergence here, like we said, there's three elements that the executive order needed. We need the implementing directive, we need the security requirements, and we need the FAR CUI rule. And then we have the DFARS rulemaking timeline. And so we're going to have a flurry of three rulemaking events that occur in rapid succession here. So like we said, they release this advance notice of rulemaking, and they essentially say, okay, we're planning on coming up with a basic clause and an enhanced clause for information that the DoD is going to send to people. And these should look very familiar, even though this was a decade ago, because they say, okay, well, any information that you get from the DoD that's not cleared for public release is going to have basic requirements applied to it. And then any information that has some particular requirements attached to it, those are going to have some additional security requirements that get applied to it. And they described these requirements in what they called plain English. They didn't specify anything. They just said, these are the broad capabilities that need to be applied to these various forms of data. And if you are reading between the lines here, everything in the left in blue ends up becoming what we now know as CMMC Level 1. Everything in the right ends up becoming DFARS 7012, which is effectively tantamount to CMMC Level 3, but we'll get to those connections in the future. But they put a big caveat in the rule, and they say, okay, listen, the CUI program is it's been kicked off. It's going to take a while to finish. We don't know when it's going to happen. We have our own reasons for protecting data and deciding to design these rules. And so we're going to get the ball rolling because this is pretty fundamental stuff. And then as the CUI program starts to formalize, we'll begin to amend these rules to point to that specific guidance, but we're not going to just wait around because we don't know how long it's going to take, which is, otherwise fine. So they get a bunch of feedback from folks, and primarily the main consideration that comes into play is that the plain English requirements are not specific enough. They're too nebulous. They're too broad. So they say, okay, we're going to still do a basic and an enhanced clause. There's still going to be relatively the same amount of data types that are relevant to the protections. But then we start to see some very interesting explanations of their rationale behind justifying the reason for making the rule and some of the common criticisms that arise around the cost of implementing these protections. And they say, listen, on the basic side, the cost impact of doing these things is not significant. These are considered to be first level protective measures, they say. And this is just going to be stuff that you do on an average day-to-day part of running your business as a prudent business owner. The cost of not using these controls is an enormous detriment to you. It's an enormous detriment to the DoD. It has distinct negative impacts on your system and on our information, and therefore they do this interesting sort of logical jump there, and they say because they're bad. Since we're mandating that you put them in place, it is actually a value to you and a value to us. Everybody wins. On the enhanced side, they say, well, the cost impacts here are going to be relative. And they openly admit that there are economies of scale at place. Large contractors are at a distinct advantage. Small businesses are at a disadvantage on a relative basis. And that because they have less sophisticated programs, the cost of meeting the additional requirements is going to be greater on a relative basis for smaller companies. And that a reasonable rule of thumb that they've established is that for small businesses, your percentage of you would spend 0.5% of your annual revenue on IT security by itself all day long. So for a lot of people, when they think about their IT security budget, that is a huge jump in what they actually spend on security as a dedicated line item. And when you zoom out and think about it, 0.5% is not nearly enough to spend on a dedicated security program. So either way, based off of how you view that number, it's not the best. So then they say, here's the baseline of controls from 853. Because remember, at this time, 171 doesn't even exist. We haven't gotten to step 2 of implementing the executive order yet. And so they say, here's our selection. Here's our baseline of controls out of 853 that you need to implement as a part of the enhanced requirements for protecting our data. So some time goes by. They go through the comment process. Everybody submits their comments, criticisms, and support for the rule. And then we get the final rule. And they say, okay, we got rid of these basic requirements. We're going to put those in the FAR. That's going to be a separate rulemaking process. We're just going to focus on the enhanced requirements. And this is where we start to see DFARS 7012 as we know it today for the very first time. Remember, all the way back in 2013, so this is not something new. And they give us some more explanations of their rationale. And they say, okay, well, after we got some comments back on the proposed rule, we decided, you know what, we're going to downscope the scope of information that's actually relevant to the enhanced requirements. The primary criticism that was submitted via the comment period on the rule was that all these relevant data types that you're going to have are problematic because the data isn't marked. Remember, this is in 2013. Prior to that, people were submitting comments, which is exactly the same set of comments that people have today. The data fundamentally is not marked. And they say, okay, that's fine. We're going to do you a favor. We're going to downscope the rule until the CUI program actually starts to formalize and come out. But we've been marking CTI according to 523024 since 1985. And so that's explicitly marked. Those are the data categories that you're going to have to use for these enhanced requirements. And they say some more rationale for the cost impact because the majority of the comments are concerned with the impact of cost. And they say implementing the controls is going to increase cost to the department. Implementing the controls is going to increase cost to the contractors that have to implement them, but these are going to be accounted for in the normal course of doing business. The costs are allowable. They're chargeable to indirect cost pools. Is this starting to sound familiar based off the things that we hear today? This is exactly the same process that we hear in the explanation today, except remember, this is back in 2013 for some ideas for rules that were generated all the way back in 2010. And they say the government doesn't intend to directly pay you for operating the requirements associated with the rule. And we've also saved you some money because beforehand we wanted you to retain this data indefinitely, but now you only have to retain the data for 90 days, which is a massive cost saving. Now, the most interesting part whenever a final rule comes out is that they adjudicate all of the individual comments that are submitted. They actually meticulously go through and they do a very good job of explaining why they made a decision. The problem is that not everybody will agree with why they made the decision. So final rules are very, very long, and they're very, very repetitive, and they're written in a distinctly government style. So I've done my best here to try to paraphrase the theme of the comments that are submitted and then the direct responses from the government. You can go through and take a look at what they say here and then just Control F in the Federal Register to figure out where and what page they came from. In the slide doc that's associated with this presentation, all of these will be annotated, but we can effectively walk through their explanation and then start to see the picture that emerges. And so people submit the same comments back in 2013 that we hear today, this exact same criticisms. They say these are not risk-based controls, and the burden associated with these controls is actually more like what I would need to do for a classified system. And then DoD says, well, that's not actually true because we're not asking you to stand up an entire program like we would for a classified system. These are specific capabilities that this system that already exists should be able to provide. That's why we've cut it down to such a small set of requirements. And then people say, well, small business doesn't have any infrastructure, and this is going to be way more expensive on a relative basis, which they had already previously sort of preemptively addressed. And they start to generate this theme, and they say the contractor size classification, that's not a sufficient reason to allow somebody to not have to protect data that needs to be protected. This should also sound very familiar with the same narrative that we hear today. And people say, listen, it's just too expensive. It's just, the costs are just too large. And this is a really fun sort of logical sequence that the DoD walks through. They say, we picked things from 853. 853 is very similar to ISO 27000. Industry uses ISO 27000. Therefore, we can use 853 controls because they'll be in line with what industry can support. Now, anybody who's familiar with 853 or with ISO 27000 will know how ridiculous that statement is, but it is a statement that they made, and that is the logic that they're using in order to address the criticisms based off of cost. Somebody actually submits a comment that says, hey, isn't this going to be prone to erroneous inclusion? We're going to provide this to people who don't need it, or at worst, we're not going to provide the clause to the folks who do need to protect data. And the DoD says, yeah, when we balance those two things together, what we're going to do is we're going to prescribe that the DFARS clause that needs to protect information goes in all contracts and solicitations, period. And it will only apply when the data is actually present. Does this also sound familiar? This is really where the idea of prescribing the clause in all contracts and solicitations originally came from. It was based off of a suggestion in one of the comments that was provided to the DoD. And they say the cost of implementing this program, it outweighs the benefits of information security. And the DoD basically completely dismisses this. They say, listen, you cannot quantify the value of the data that needs to be protected in aggregate on a department-wide basis. And so it is not possible for us to determine the point where the costs are going to equal the benefit on a small company by small company basis. We're thinking sort of enterprise-wide here across the global DoD system. And then folks also say, well, if the protections have to be associated with the data and then I have to send the data downstream, it's going to be pretty difficult to make sure that all that stuff follows along with it. And the DoD says that is not an excuse to waver from what the baseline requirements that we've determined to be necessary are. It's your responsibility as a contractor to make sure that wherever the data goes, that the people who receive it are also capable of receiving it in accordance with what we stipulate in the contract clause. And they say, listen, it's just too burdensome for small business. It's just too much. We just can't handle it. The people won't be able to participate. We've completely underestimated the cost as a percentage of overall revenue. Maybe we need, a phased rollout, if you will, some sort of phased approach, and that would ease the financial burden. And the DoD says we took all this into consideration. We're not going to change the rule in any way based off of any of those pieces of feedback. The estimated burden is reduced because we reduce the scope of the data associated with the rule to just CTI, even though we know that there's going to be more data coming in the future. Hint, hint. And they say the final rule overall was written with the idea that we're minimizing the burden for compliance. We didn't include anything that we didn't need to. Therefore, the rule is it's as small of a burden as we could possibly engineer. They changed the set of controls slightly. It went from 59 to 60. A couple of them get substituted, and essentially they snap this baseline, and they say this is the baseline of controls that you need for protecting information at the enhanced level. And so we get to the end of 2013, we have our baseline of rules. The federal government's still burning down its organizational debt. We kicked everything out from the basic clause and created a separate FAR rule, which ends up becoming what they call FAR basic. Now remember, this is not the FAR CUI rule. This is something separate. This is FAR basic that eventually becomes CMMC level 1. We still don't have the FAR CUI rule. So they released this baseline, and then NIST and NARA actually protest the determination that they made for what the information security controls in their baseline decided to be. And they say, listen, when the executive order was written and we stood up the CUI program, NARA was put in charge of making sure that we apply the same protections holistically across the government for CUI information. FISMA specifically rescinded the waivers from legislation in the 80s that allow individual agencies like the DoD to determine their own fates and have their own waivers for different categorizations. So we need to filter the set of controls from 853 through the categorization process, and then what pops out based off what applies to the data is going to be the resulting control baseline, and that is what we should prescribe in the rulemaking process. And if you do that, you go through that categorization process, CUI is categorized at the moderate impact level for confidentiality, and that results in far more controls than the sliver that you put into your final rule and prescribe to the contracting base. So when you go through and tailor, when you go through and change the baseline, how did you go from the moderate confidentiality baseline to your green DoD sliver of a baseline? And the DoD says, well, there's stuff in that baseline that is ostensibly not applicable. There's going to be things that are too prescriptive. There's going to be things that are maybe too burdensome. There's going to be things that only apply to the federal government. There's all kinds of stuff in that baseline because it's the federal baseline that isn't going to necessarily apply to the contractors. So we had to make some decisions. And NIST and NARA say, well, you didn't ask us, and that's not our baseline. DoD essentially responds and says, well, we put a caveat in our rule that as soon as the FAR rule comes out and then you have the security requirement specification, we'll amend our rule to point to the FAR rule. So where's the FAR rule? And NIST and NARA say, we're not even close. We haven't even started. We haven't even started yet. Remember, this is 2013. The executive order implementing directive that comes out won't happen for another 3 years. Today, in 2021, we still don't have the FAR rule. And so eventually, at the end of this debate, they say, we're going to have to create a special publication. We're going to have to engineer those security requirements way ahead of schedule because DoD is perfectly justified in doing their own rulemaking process. And so they go off and they start to engineer this special publication for publication in the future, and we'll be able to amend the rules to point to those security requirements to update this rule that DoD made. But remember, as of right now, those security requirements are in the contracts. People are signing the contracts. They're putting RFPs in. They're self-attesting to saying, hey, I'm going to put in these requirements. It's only 60 at this point, but we have still snapped the baseline. So we're engineering our security requirements. The proposed rule for the implementing directive finally comes out 5 years after the executive order, and then disaster happens. OPM gets hacked. At the time, it's the single largest and most impactful data breach in the history of the federal government. The overall impacts and fallout from the OPM breach are still unknown. They probably will be unknown forever, but untold damage to the federal government, its operations, the intelligence community, absolutely cannot understate how impactful and damaging this issue was. So according to the folks at NIST, when they recount this story, they get a call from the White House and they say, what do you got? What do you have for us? And they say, well, luckily, we've been engineering this security control catalog that applies to federal data in non-federal systems, exactly what happened in OPM. And the White House says, okay, send it. Remember, we don't have the first part of the executive order implementation in place yet. We're now in step 2 and we're going to publish it. So we publish 800-171, and then there's several events that happen, and we start to get explanations about how we created 800-171. And the overall theme, every time people at NIST and NARA and DoD explain how we engineered NIST 800-171, is we made lots and lots of assumptions. So Ron Ross gets up at the ISU open house event in 2015, and he says, listen, people already have systems in place. They're already doing things in order to protect information in their non-federal businesses because they have to. They have to be able to stay in business. If you don't have an information security program in the modern world, how on earth are you still in business? And so because those infrastructures already exist, because those security programs already exist, we're not going to tell you to do things that you're already doing. They actually specifically say many times, we don't want to be bureaucratic. We are the government, but we don't want to be bureaucratic. We don't want to tell you things that you're already doing. We want to minimize the burden. We want to do the right thing. We've heard what people have said in previous rulemaking. We want to make the minimum viable baseline for protecting this data. And so in order to do that, we're going to build off of the things that should already be in place. Now, the process of doing that, some of those assumptions might be wrong, but like Ron says, we have to make some design decisions in order to come up with this baseline. And so effectively, they step through this process exactly like what the DoD had explained back in 2013. And they say, listen, if we take the moderate confidentiality baseline, it's 262 controls out of the entire catalog of 853, thousands of controls. We filter it based off of the impact level and the categorization of the data in accordance with what needs to happen, per legislation, essentially. And we end up with 262 things. And so they say, well, listen, there's going to be some categories of these controls that actually are straight not applicable. And those are going to be what they call Fed controls or federally specific controls. And these are things that are called out in 853, like specific roles and responsibilities, specific technologies, things like that. So obviously those are not applicable, but there's really only 18 of them out of 262. Then they say, well, there's going to be some controls in here that aren't exactly, specifically, directly related to the protection of the confidentiality of CUI itself. And these are going to be things that are more maybe at the system level or the programmatic level, your overall information security program. We're only telling people what they need to do for this specific data. We assume the system's there. We assume the program is already there, so we can get rid of a bunch of these requirements. And then they say, okay, well, there's going to be some other stuff that's just so basic and fundamental, we are not going to be expected to have to satisfy, or we're just going to expect that people are going to routinely satisfy these requirements. And then we're going to take the language in FIPS 200 for some of the remaining controls that are left over that are very, very prescriptive, maybe like from a system design perspective. And we're just going to say, you know what? These are the capabilities that your existing system needs to live up to. We're not going to tell you how to design the system because that would be way too prescriptive. That would involve way too much information. Now, remember, when we go through this tailoring process, the only thing that is actually not applicable are going to be the controls that are involved with federal information, federal specific controls. Everything else that exists in the tailoring process to go from 262 to 110 are assumptions. They assume that these things are already in place. Now, they don't say that this is a specific requirement, but this creates a significant problem because what happens if you have performance-based capability statements requirements that surround the data and the system or the program are not also in place? Because as we know, as we've come to learn painfully, across the contracting base, especially across the defense industrial base, the system level controls and the programs are just not there. So if you take data-based, hyper-specific security controls and you put them into a organization that does not have the corresponding support for them, things are going to break. And inadvertently in this process of trying to reduce the burden, to try to make things easier for everybody, to try to be as non-bureaucratic as possible, we start to expose a flaw in the logic. And the tailoring process of stacking assumptions on each other, because remember, we can never really get rid of controls. We can just assume that they're there or not, represents this sort of inverse proportion. So if we have a smaller and smaller baseline to the left here, then we're assuming a higher and higher amount of relative maturity within the organization that's receiving the baseline. Well, what happens if the organization has very low maturity? Well, if the organization has very low maturity and the system or the program is not in a place, then we have to specify, we have to unwind and walk back the assumptions that were made, which is going to cause the baseline to be even larger. And so if we say, okay, well, the 110 are too specific, we assume that the maturity level is too high, we have to revisit these assumptions and say, well, now we have to specify this, or now we have to specify that. So you can probably see where this is going if you're familiar with what is in CMMC. And this isn't just theory. We've actually seen this happen. So in 2018, at a big event, at a sort of CUI industry day, Gus Gasani gets out there and he says, listen, we got really tired of having to tell people this is how you're going to document your information security program. And so let me move myself out of the way here so that you guys can actually see the full quote. So they say, we got really tired of having to explain to people exactly what this information security program documentation needs to be, because we assumed that you already knew that a system security plan is the fundamental way of making sure that everything is documented. So in the original version of NIST 800-171, the system security plan was an NFO control, something that the government didn't think they needed to specify. Well, hold on, I'll go hang out over here with Gary. There we go. So they say, listen, this is something that we don't think we should have to specify. And then based off of the feedback that they received, they said, okay, well, now we're going to have to take it out of the assumptions, out of the tailoring criteria in Appendix E, and we're going to have to include it as a specific control. Now, based off of what we know of the fallout of these requirements and regulations over time, it sort of begs the question why more of these controls have not been taken out of the tailoring appendix in Appendix E and then included in the overall baseline. But as you can tell, if we start to do that, we're going to dramatically expand the size of the overall baseline, and thus we're going to increase the burden. We're going to talk about that some more. Okay, so we get through saying, here's 800-171 and here's how it works, and then the fallout of the OPM hack. Move myself back over here so you can see. In the fallout of the OPM hack, we're going to have some more rulemaking. So we're going to end up going through another series of 3 rulemaking events in order to update the existing rules that were already there. And they say, okay, listen, people aren't necessarily familiar with these requirements despite the fact that they've been in their contracts. So as a result, we're going to specify a provision and we're going to update the clause. So when you get an RFP, there's going to be a provision that says these are the requirements that you're going to need to uphold whenever you actually start to execute the contract if it's awarded. And then when you get the contract, you're going to have a clause in place that says these are the requirements. So then there's, there's a lot of information whenever you go through the rules, but some of this information sort of starts to float up to the top. And so overall, they're establishing provisions to make sure that people are aware of what's going on. And they say, listen, we've got some awesome features in this new updated rule. Because the actual baseline that really applied was not 60 things, it was 262 things. But then we went through the process of creating 800-171. What we actually did was reduce your burden by 30%. So if you were paying attention to what was in your contracts in 2013, and then you were paying attention to the proposed rule that came out in 2015, you'd say we went from 60 to 110. That's not actually true. They went from 262 down to 110, and with some creative government math, they say that's about 30% of a reduction in your overall burden. The relevant data types now are going to expand dramatically. Remember, the rule in 2013 constrained and reduced the data types. Here, because of the OPM hack, they said that was too much. We were too aggressive in the reduction of what the scope of the data was, so we're going to have to expand the relevant data types. And in order to do that, they start to develop this term called covered defense information. Over time, as you start to look at the relevant data types in all of the rules, you can start to see the overall CUI program have more and more of an effect as it accumulates over time. As the government starts to burn down its organizational debt, they start to get more and more coherent and more concise in the explanation of what is going on, what needs to be protected, what's relevant, what applies to what. It's still not perfect, obviously. This is only in 2015, but it's a dramatic change from what was going on in 2010. So then several events happen in sequence here. We get the final rule that comes out for the implementing directive for the CUI program overall. We get a revision to 800-171 that starts to walk back some assumptions in a very tiny manner. And then we actually get the final rule for the FAR basic case. Now, the implementing directive in 32 CFR and the FAR case themselves, we just don't have enough time to go into them. But you can start to see in those rules that are published in the Federal Register, especially when you go from proposed or interim rule to the final rule and the adjudication of comments, the same themes start to apply over and over again around the government, regardless of which agency is publishing rules regarding the protection of CUI. So in the final rule that comes out in November of 2016, they say, okay, we're going to have the revision, we're going to have the clause, We're going to include cloud service providers as a FedRAMP moderate equivalency as a result of the nature of the OPM hack. We've said, okay, there's going to be a COTS exemption, and that's going to save a ton of money, and that the need to protect the CDI is not going to change just because it's shared with small entities. They revisit this theme from 2013. They say, we're going to save small businesses money because COTS is exempted, but just because you're small, if you actually receive this data in the course of doing business, that is not a sufficient reason to be able to kick out of the baseline that applies to you through the FISMA process, formalized through the CUI program. They say, listen, we created this set of security requirements. I mean, this is a fundamental part of implementing the overall CUI program per the executive order, and it reduces your burden because we went through and got rid of anything that was not absolutely specifically required for protecting only the confidentiality of CUI at a minimum. That was the only thing that we tried to specify. We reduced the burden to all the way to the logical conclusion that we could get to. And they say it's going to provide a benefit to everybody, just like it did when we proposed our rule back in 2010, because if you're protecting our data, that means that the controls are also protecting your data. It is a valuable exercise for you. It's a valuable exercise for us. Everybody wins. And if you are going to try to vary, by the way, there is essentially a 2 basis test that you're going to go through in order to vary, because ultimately you cannot vary from this baseline. There is no floor beyond 800.171 because the government is in charge of tailoring information. The government is in charge of making risk decisions regarding CUI overall. Going through that tailoring process and engineering 800.171 was the risk-based process that they needed to go through. And so if you have to vary from the baseline, you essentially get one of 2 options. You either ask for an adjudication from the DoD CIO that says the basis for the control does not exist. For instance, wireless protections. We don't have wireless, therefore it does not apply. Or you have some set of equivalent protections in place. Now remember, this is not saying that because it's expensive or because you're small or because you didn't know or because of this or because of that or any of the reasons that pop up in the comments on the rule that you'll be able to vary from the baseline. You either implement everything according to the rules, you implement alternatives that meet the requirements in the rules, or the basis is not there. That's really it. And ultimately, if there is going to be some change in what's going on, it has to go through the DoD CIO adjudication. Just because you receive the data from the government does not permit you to make risk-based trade-off decisions to vary from the baseline on behalf of the government. And so because it's a final rule, we get to go through a significant amount of comment analysis, just like we did on the first one. And they say, hey, it's too expensive. Just like we said beforehand, there should be an alternative approach for small businesses. And the DoD says, you know what? We actually went through and did that analysis. We said, what happens if we just give small business an outright exemption? They say, what if we delay the implementation requirements here in order to get the exact cost estimates, the exact cost analysis? And what happens if we create a completely different set of security requirements specifically for small business? And the DoD says we rejected all of those ideas because the overarching purpose of the rule is to increase the security of the information that we have determined will cause harm if it's going to be released. Remember, this is in the wake of OPM. At the time, a complete sea change in the federal government's perspective on the risk that unclassified information could present when it's compromised in non-federal systems. And then they repeat again, regardless of the size of the contractor or subcontractor handling the information, the protections have to apply the same across the board. You can see this in 800.171. The very first assumption that is outlined at the very beginning of 800.171 is that the regulations and the protections that apply to CUI are consistent regardless of where the data goes. We hear this ad nauseum today in the phrase, the controls follow the data. Controls following the data has been this theme that has been pulled through the rulemaking process now for 6 years at this point on the timeline. People say, again, small business is going to be able to, they won't be able to afford the investment. It's going to cause barriers to entry. And the DoD says, listen, we've already been making rules since 2013 when we published our final rule. We've established the baseline. People have been coming in and out of the market. They've been implementing things. They've been refreshing things. We cannot calculate what it's going to cost in order to participate with the rule. The cost is based off of what your specific situation is, and the requirements are based off of the assumption that you already have things in place. And so as a result, the costs to comply for new contractors it's going to be significant. It's going to cause barriers to entry. Now, a key point to remember here is if you are actually a new contractor, the costs are going to be significant. If you are an existing contractor and you're suddenly realizing that the rules exist, you're effectively a new contractor, which means that the costs for you will also be significant. And then people say the DoD should provide services or they should provide costs to offset, the consultation that we'll need, especially the consultants, right? We're going to need subsidies for those guys. And they say we don't do cost recovery models. This is just like any other DFARS rule that we put out there that we don't give cost recovery models for. The costs of compliance are allowable, and you should take into consideration what these costs are going to be when you submit your bid on the RFP, when you submit your proposal, because it's in the provision. It's been in the provisions for 3 years now. We're making an explicit provision now. It's an allowable cost, and that's how it should be accounted for. And then somebody, probably the same people who said, hey, you want to include this in all contracts back in 2013, they say, there's no oversight mechanism here. We're just going to be relying on self-attestation. Doesn't that seem like a problem? And the DoD says we don't require a certification, right? And this is in 2016, and it's actually very interesting to hear. Let me move myself out of the way again. It's very interesting to hear the explanations about why they specifically wanted to avoid using certification mechanisms for contractor compliance. They say, we've already had bad experiences with this. And Devin Casey in 2018 says, we don't want to use verification mechanisms unless it's absolutely necessary. So we snapped a baseline at the end of 2013. OPM happens. We have to expand the rules. We have to expand the relevant data types. We have to formalize the security requirements. And we snap another baseline at the end of 2016. So remember, there's actually 2 interim rules. There's one that came out in August of 2015, one that came out in December 2015. In December of 2015, they say, listen, we're hearing what you're saying, and you're not saying that you didn't implement anything off of the 2013 rule and the baseline that existed there. You're just saying you need a little more time to make sure you get in compliance with the rule. So we're going to give everybody an extension, and the extension will be the end of December 2017. So if you read your current contracts with the current form of DFARS 7012, they'll say these requirements have to be implemented by December 31st, 2017. It came as the extension granted from the interim rule that was created in December of 2015. So at this point, we've now gone from November of 2013 to the end of 2017, 4 years to get into compliance with all of these requirements. We have the formalized federal CUI rule implementing directive. All the agencies now that is written are going to start going through their training programs. They're going to start to create their own individual agency CUI programs. That's going to kickstart the marking process. We're still in the middle of that process crystallizing at this point, which is why a lot of data is still not marked. But the DoD said you have to do it at least for CTI, and you have to do it for these other forms under the umbrella of CDI. So we can see that even though the events have started to happen out of sequence, everything's moving in the same direction slowly but surely. The FAR basic rule is solidified. The security requirements are published. The implementing directive is published. Everyone got an extension, got to the end of 2017, and we all lived happily ever after. Except that isn't what happened. In fact, after the implementation deadline comes and goes, it is an endless parade of industry reports and analysis that show that things are bad, things are getting worse, the threat landscape is getting way more intense, the threats are increasing on an exponential basis every day. The industrial base is hemorrhaging data. The data is not protected. Every time the DoD starts a new weapon system program, China seems to miraculously end up with a carbon copy of it, like F-35 turning into J-31, the stealing of Sea Dragon undersea warfare technology. I mean, spin the wheel, and there's a million examples of why we snapped these compliance baselines, and things don't seem to be working. So the DoD actually starts an IG report. They go through for about 2 years, and they systematically go through the industrial base and they evaluate the contractor's implementation of these requirements. And the findings are really, really bad. They say at best, maybe 50% of these requirements are in place in the best set of contractors that have implemented these requirements. It is nothing's getting done. Nothing's being protected. So Congress hears about this, and the Senate Armed Services Committee report that eventually informs the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act says, we're very worried about this. This is a serious problem. Remember, this is at the congressional level, by the way. And they say, we believe that prime contractors need to be held responsible and accountable for protecting this information, and that we're going to hold them responsible and accountable as a first step towards ensuring the security of the supply chain, a first step. And sure enough, Section 1648 of the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act says we're going to create a verification mechanism that's going to be imposed on the defense industrial base for the specific purpose of assessing the cybersecurity of individual contractors. And that's how we end up getting CMMC. So based off what we know at this point, we know that CMMC didn't just come out of nowhere. And that, if anything, it is on the tail end here of years of the evolution of the rulemaking process on behalf of the federal government. It is a cog in the wheel, if you will, on this landscape of what's going on. And so if we zoom in on what's actually in the interim rule, what's actually in the various clauses and provisions specified by the rule, this slide is essentially all of the webinars that have occurred over the last 2 years in some form. So we're not going to go into detail about what's going on specifically in any of these. But, the interesting part about reading the rules, whether they're interim rules, whether they're final rules, when you read them in their totality, and they are very, very long and dense, but when you start to distill what's going on in the rules, you can see the thread of rationale changing over the years. And there's all these interesting pieces of information. Well, I say interesting. Other people might have more colorful terms to use. But, there's just these very interesting pieces of analysis that you can see the set of assumptions ratcheting up over the years. We made assumptions when we snapped the baseline in 2013, and then we had to react to that in order to create the security requirements baseline, which involved more assumptions. And then we, as a result of a massive data breach with OPM, had to snap more assumptions by having additional rulemaking with completely justified expansions to relevant data types and security controls, all the while saying the arguments around it being expensive are not a sufficient reason to dismiss them. And you can see the accumulation of these assumptions in certain things that are said in the current interim rule, where they say you should have already had an SSP. I mean, we updated the security baseline to specifically include SSPs as a requirement because people didn't know what was going on. And you have had an extension in order to implement the updated, less burdensome, more clear and concise set of security requirements on top of systems that we assumed already existed, on top of the partial baseline that we gave you in 2013. And so as a result, when you go through for 7019 and 7020 to do your self-assessment and generate what people today call your SPRS score, this shouldn't cost you any money. This shouldn't take you any time. You're just going through your SSP saying, well, I don't have that, I don't have that, I don't have that, subtracting those points and then submitting your score. That should take you less than an hour, and it should take you about $75. Now, for most people, when they see this, they say, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. I mean, it's taking days, weeks, months to go through your system to figure out what's in place, what's not in place, to figure out how to write an SSP, get your SPRS. I mean, there's all of these things that have to go into place. But when we zoom out and look at the overall evolution of the program, this conclusion is, I mean, it isn't correct, but it's not unreasonable. And so I always like to point people to the rules, because a lot of the things that people are curious about in terms of how much it's going to cost or why this is happening or what's going on with the rule are explained in meticulous detail in the rulemaking process about how much things are going to cost, why they're going to cost that much, whether they're actually going to be required or not, which is an odd caveat when you talk about CMMC level 2. They're saying, well, we don't anticipate that we're going to actually have any contracts at CMMC level 2. And I don't know what kind of companies are in the market for spending $50,000 on something that's not required. But it just goes to show that the rules contain a lot of information that I highly recommend people review in order to gain more perspective. Because if you only start with the most final rule, or if you only start with the current version of the model or the security requirements, you're missing the context of how the logic got us to the certain situation that causes everything to function in a seemingly nonsensical way. Okay. So let's revisit, the idea here of what CMMC is actually doing. CMMC is not a new thing, if you will. It is the current iteration of an overall data reform program that has existed for years and years. And so every time we go through issuing a DFARS case, a proposed rule, an interim rule, a final rule over the years, slowly but surely what's happening is we're burning down the organizational debt on behalf of the government. Now, it takes a long time, and if you only ever see an individual part of them issuing the rules, it won't make sense what's happening overall. But we can see that the trend is slowly but surely decreasing. The CUI program is in place. The agency deadlines for training their workforces is in December of 2021. Everything is starting to fall into place, and after a while, the organizational debt will be so small that there won't be any wiggle room. The relevant data types will be crystallized. The data will be marked. Everyone will be trained. The contract officers will know what's going on. As that has occurred, the organizational debt, as evidenced by, literally any report written over the last few years that tries to survey cybersecurity in the contracting base, shows that the organizational debt is increasing at probably an equivalent rate. This is not mathematical in any way. It's just conceptual. And an interesting metric that we can use to overlay on top of those things is the number of page views that are displayed on the Federal Register website per the individual rule publications. And so you can see that where the orange line crosses the green line is probably about the point in time where people wake up and say, this came out of nowhere. I don't understand why it's happening. Why is this happening? How did this come to be? Why are things the way they are? The overall page views over the years remained pretty much flat. The only people who were reading the rules were rules nerds like me. And then as soon as DFARS, the DFARS interim rule comes out that says everyone's going to be assessed, you actually have to go through an assessment and prove what's going on, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. Then all of a sudden the attention catches up, but the organizational debt that takes years to burn down regardless of where it is has reached all-time highs. So let's look at what CMMC is actually doing in relation to 800-171. So if we walk through the process of developing 800-171 through this system of tailoring requirements, and you compare that to what is actually contained within the CMMC model, the vast majority of all of the requirements at CMMC level 3 and below are the exact same requirements in NIST 800-171. They're just called something new. And now that's very annoying and it's probably unnecessary, but they're just called something new. And so you can do the direct translation. The direct translation is included in an appendix in CMMC. The only thing that is actually new is what people call the Delta 20, or the other half of the pyramid that you always see in different webinars or in the model that shows the process maturity half. And the process maturity half, when people read it, they say, this seems like a ton of work. This seems like a huge amount of additional work. The Delta 20 is a bunch of new things that I have to do on top of what's already going on. But when we take a look at what those things actually are, and this is a whole webinar in and of itself, but conceptually, just stick with me here. The process maturity requirements contain things like documented policies, documented procedures, resource plans, and what are the assumptions that we made when we developed 800-171 for the basis of the performance requirements in 800-171. They were things like policies and procedures, having system security architecture, having resource allocation, having system documentation. If we look at what's in the Delta 20, some of those map directly back to the things that are included in the NCO controls, the things that are not directly related to the confidentiality of information, but are related to the system that the information is contained on, or the program that the system and the data are governed by. And so if we admit that the assumptions that were used to create 800-171 were too aggressive, they were a false premise, and that inadvertently assumed a lot of maturity on behalf of the contracting base and made the burden higher, but is not a reason to get rid of the baseline. It's actually a reason to retreat back to a larger baseline. Then when we look at the burden of CMMC, of all the new things in CMMC, we have to understand that it's actually also inadvertently satisfying the exact same thing that we did when we moved SSPs from an assumption to an explicit requirement. So that feeling of CMMC being a burden is actually a paradox, because the increased burden by specifying more requirements is necessary to explain what needs to go around the data protections, what needs to go around the performance requirements that were specified. And so just to explain maybe the hole that has been dug here as organizational debt has accumulated, for new contractors or for people who are effectively new to the rules, this is going to be significant to have to comply with. And then we made the assumption that people are not going to have to create entirely new environments in order to comply with what's going on. Now, they won't specify what the estimated costs are, but a more obscure document, 800-171B, essentially gets to the idea that doing the basic changes or the network isolation necessary somewhere in the ballpark is going to cost, somewhere between $10,000 and $500,000, which is probably correct. And that based off the assumption that you're spending 0.5% of total revenues, if you're a $5 million a year company and you've had these assumptions and these rules since 2013, the cost to create a completely new isolated network is about in line with what you spent over the last decade. So if you suddenly find yourself needing to comply with what's going on and you do actually have to create a new environment because the way that your current environment evolved is not going to work, then you're looking at trying to burn down a decade's worth of organizational debt in the process of the phased rollout provided by CMMC. Now remember, the cost estimates for CMMC only apply to the new work. Let's back up just a second here. They only apply to the deltas. They don't apply to the existing requirements for 800-171. They're very explicit about that in the webinars. They're very explicit about that in the rules. And so the cost estimates only apply to the things that you should not have already implemented, only new specifications. The assessment costs are separate. The engineering costs are separate. Everything in 800-171, which is the majority of CMMC anyways, is already water under the bridge. And so when you react and you say that's expensive or that's burdensome or that's a crushing obligation on small business, we can't deal with that. It's going to create a barrier to entry. It's going to keep people from participating. It's going to cost the DoD money. It's going to cost taxpayers money. Knowing what we know off the body of rules and how they've adjudicated those comments, the same ones that have been submitted on the rule currently, what do you think their explanations are going to be? What do you think their answers are going to be? All right, so just to sum up, there's a couple key takeaways here. So remember, CMMC did not just show up out of the blue. It is the current first step as described by Congress in making sure that we are going to be able to secure the supply chain in a reliable way. It's also very important to remember that this overall timeline, as crazy as it looked on the other slide, is not stopping. If anything, it's accelerating. SolarWinds happened right after the interim rule was published. Just think of SolarWinds as the new OPM. The subsequent rulemaking that's going to occur as a result of SolarWinds, we can already see coming because there's an executive order by the Biden administration on software security. So everything that we've gone through with the various rules iterations so far is going to repeat itself. We also basically know what the final rule is going to say in regards to the comments that people really care about in terms of the cost of compliance, in terms of the burden of compliance, in terms of alternatives to compliance, in terms of exemptions to compliance. Remember, organizational debt is the enemy, and this is going to be a specific piece of advice that I have for everyone. There is a limit to how much a technology solution can help with non-technological problems. If the overall solution to compliance with CMMC and DFARS were a technology solution, it would be on a GSA schedule. Now, technology is very important, and technology is rapidly commoditizing. It's going to be more and more affordable and more effective as time goes on. But even though that is the scariest and most foreign part of CMMC and DFARS compliance for most people, it is not actually the majority of the problem, and it is not actually even the majority of the requirements that are specified in the model. So my consulting recommendation to you for free here in this talk is be extremely skeptical of anyone who is a vendor or a solution provider or a consultant that's partnered with technologies and solutions that are promising you suspiciously high percentages of compliance as a result of their technology. Remember, the burden here is actually a bit of a paradox, and we've only uncovered this as a result of, reading all the rules. And honestly, if it weren't for coronavirus lockdowns, I probably wouldn't have gone through and read all the rules to the level and extent that I did. Very few people read the rules. almost no one reads all of the rules, and certainly very few people have ever tried to map out the story of the rules on a timeline. And when we map out what's gone on here, the government tried to do the right thing. They tried to minimize these burdens and say, we're not going to be bureaucratic. We're going to try to make sure and minimize the burden. We're going to not tell people to do things they're already doing. That's not going to help. And so they accidentally created a set of requirements that assume a higher level of maturity. And then now that time is run out, the threat landscape is incredibly insane. We're hemorrhaging all this data and we're losing the war. We decided that we're going to build a maturity model off of the assumption of maturity in the first place. Now, fundamentally, CMMC is just a verification mechanism for 800.171. It's called something different. The marketing around it hasn't been great. The explanations about why it's happening leave a lot to be desired. But ultimately, what it does, also inadvertently, is walk back the assumptions that are baked into 800.171, which increases your burden by being a bigger requirement list, but actually helps the burden by specifying what to do. Now, it isn't complete, and this implies the idea that the Delta 20 should actually be something like the Delta 250, because if we don't have programs in place and we don't have security systems in place, and we just need to protect the data, we're going to have to instruct and teach people how to put those other requirements in place. And that means that the catalog of requirements is going to be bigger. We are going to march back towards the moderate confidentiality baseline that NIST and NARA brought up back in 2013. And so just to revisit here at the very end, CMMC is not the forest. It's not a tree, like I say here in the very first takeaway. It is the leaves on a single tree. It doesn't matter who's in charge. It doesn't matter which personalities are running the program. The AB that's in charge of the training ecosystem is not CMMC. Just revisit the timeline slide when you get some time and think about the fact that CMMC is just a step in a long line of steps that will continue into the future for trying to protect this information.